Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Women Who Dared discussion and Q&A. My name is Emily Hillwright. I'm the Director of Operations at the Merchants House Museum. The Merchants House is New York City's only family home preserved intact, both inside and out. Built in 1832, it was home to a prosperous merchant class family, the Treadwells, and their Irish servants for nearly 100 years. The last family member, Gertrude, died in the house in 1933, and it opened as a museum 3 years later. The house today is complete with the Treadwell family's original furniture, decorative arts, and personal possessions, even their clothing, and offers an intimate look at domestic life in mid-19th century New York. Find out more about the museum on our website at merchantshouse.org. This is an interactive discussion tonight, so once we get started, feel free to jump in with questions and comments, and you're welcome to respond to one another as well. We want this to be a fun, interactive experience. During our chat, though, please remember to mute yourself when you're not talking so that we can keep background noises to a minimum. The meeting tonight is being recorded and will be posted on the museum's YouTube channel. If you prefer to remain anonymous, feel free to type your comments or questions in the chat. I will be keeping an eye on it, and I'm happy to share anything posted there without naming names. So without further ado, I will turn the reins over to our wonderful museum historian, Ann Haddad, and we can get started.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so delighted to see so many of you here this evening to join in our discussion and Q&A about our series, Women Who Dared, 19th Century Women Writers. I thought I would begin, just in case some of you have were not able to listen to any of the stories, by reading the introduction that I read prior to each event. And I wanted to tell you how this series came to be. So last fall and winter, one of my colleagues at the museum, Dale Vandersand, created a short story reading series. He did two, actually, that were related to Halloween and the Christmas and other holidays in December. And it was very, very successful. So I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could continue that idea and continue the short story reading, which seemed to be very popular. And I had the idea that because the Treadwells were a household of women in the 19th century, that wouldn't it be wonderful if I could read stories that the Treadwells most likely would have read, or at least would have known the authors of these stories. Unfortunately for us, our archives and the Treadwell Library really provide little information about what the Eliza Treadwell, the matriarch, and her 6 daughters were reading over all those years that they occupied the house. So I had to expand my search and go outside to look at what women of the period were reading. And what I found actually really amazed me because in this period where literature was completely male dominated, I found that there were many successful popular women writers who were being read mostly by women. But aside from a couple of the very famous ones like Louisa May Alcott and Kate Chopin, I had never heard of any of these women. And I thought, how can they have been so popular and then have just kind of faded into oblivion with the turn of the century? So most of these writers wrote a great deal of short fiction, which makes sense when you consider how little free time women had either to read for pleasure or to write. So in the series of short stories that I chose, I explored how women writers of the period gave voice to the pressing issues that were facing women by pulling back the curtains that shrouded their lives to reveal the realities of life, both inside the home and in society at large. They defied convention by invading the traditional masculine domain of literature, and these writers used their narratives to lay bare the pervasive marginalization of women who were restricted by the cult of true womanhood. And in case you're wondering what the cult of true womanhood was, it was characterized by 4 prized virtues that women should aspire to. And they were piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. And they also, these authors boldly addressed issues of racism and prejudice within society. And women, of course, were being told to suffer in silence, and they were given constant reminders of their inferiority, and they therefore felt trapped, unfulfilled, and they hungered for recognition of their plight. And as a result, these female writers became critical and commercial successes, despite the largely dismissive attitude of literary critics. And Nathaniel Hawthorne, the famous writer, notoriously wrote to his publisher in 1855 that America is now wholly given over to a damned mob of scribbling women, and I should have no chance of success while the public is occupied with their trash. Now, many of these innovative feminist-themed stories appeared in the popular periodicals of the time, including Godey's Lady's Book, Peterson's, and the Atlantic Monthly, and in popular gift books and literary annuals, where they were probably read by the Treadwell women who occupied the home on 4th Street. Since the few letters of the archives, as I said, provide little information of the inner lives of Eliza Treadwell and her 6 daughters, we were reading these stories and wondering whether or not they shared the experiences and thoughts expressed within them. Now, after being largely excluded from the American literary canon for most of the 20th century, these authors are now receiving deserved attention from literary and feminist scholars, one of whom I am thrilled to say is with us this evening, Elaine Showalter. It was through Elaine's wonderful work called Scribbling Women that I found most of the stories, all but one, I chose from her wonderful anthology. And I'm just so thrilled that she is joining us this evening. Dr. Elaine Showalter is Professor Emeritus of English and the Avalon Professor of the Humanities at Princeton University. She is the author of 10 books, including Sister's Choice, Tradition and Change in American Women's Writing, published in 1991, and A Jury of Her Peers, American Women Writers from Anne Bradstreet to Annie Proulx, published in 2009. And it was from that book that I did a lot of research and was really the basis for this decision. Her most recent book is The Civil Wars of Julia Ward Howe, and I'm going to talk about that at the end of our talk. That was published in 2016. In addition, she has written for such diverse publications as the New York Times Book Review, Washington Post, Times Literary Supplement, Vogue, and People. Now, all of these writers featured in their series were literary successes in their day, and yet, except for Louisa May Alcott, who was famous for her stories for girls, they were dropped from the literary canon and largely forgotten. And just to review, the 6 stories in the series were The Angel Over the Right Shoulder by Elizabeth Stewart Phelps, The Little Mendicants by Catherine Maria Sedgwick, The Two Offers by Frances Watkins Harper, My Contraband by Louisa May Alcott, The Storm and the Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, and coming up this Sunday, our last story will be The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So that's enough from me. Now, to set the stage for our discussion, I have asked Dr. Showalter, who, by the way, her work, A Jury of Her Peers, is the first literary history of American women writers. And I've asked her to put these authors in historical perspective and tell us a bit more about their emergence as best-selling writers who used the short story form to express their creativity and why the time was ripe for their success. Dr. Showalter, welcome.
Thank you, Annie. Yeah, I'll try to give you a picture and start out by saying, imagine you are a woman in the 19th century with the urge to write what one early woman writer called cacoethes scribendi, the itch to write, that you were cursed or blessed with the itch to write. Well, what are you going to write? And where are you going to publish it? And how successful are you going to be? Most 19th century women who had the urge to write started with poetry. And it's ironic that they started with poetry because really that is the genre that has the most rules. You know, I mean, the poetic forms are very, or go back in history. They are fairly strict. You're supposed to know them. There's, you know, intense poetic tradition. And American women's poetry in the 19th century, leave aside the great exception of Emily Dickinson, who broke all the rules, social, aesthetic, and so on. Most 19th century American women poets are not remembered. And the reason they're not remembered, there are two reasons. I mean, they really were not trained in poetic history as men were. And they wrote in hymn form, most of them in quatrains. Emily Dickinson does too. But in the hands of most American women who were starting out, these were kind of repetitious. They didn't allow for a lot of experimentation. It isn't until Dickinson, who just does what she wants to do, writes the way she wants to do, never goes out of the house, never gets married, never publishes her work. You know, and before she died, she only published 7 poems. She doesn't have to face critics. She could do it her way. But most American women poets were writing in the mass market. Eventually, they were writing against Walt Whitman, against the, you know, the force of Walt Whitman. But they really did not make much of an impact on literary history, let's say. Then there was the novel. For American women, generally, not just women writers, one of the big literary events of the 19th century was the publication of Jane Eyre, which was published in the United States in 1849. It was read everywhere. And people talk about a Jane Eyre mania. Everybody read it. It had a tremendous influence, as it did, you know, in England and in Britain. But it was a model that American women could not imagine themselves following. And there were a lot of reasons. There was the expression of passion. It took a long while for American women writers to be able to break taboos and write in that passionate way. The market was not particularly open to women writers. And the novel was a demanding form. So while there was an enormous number of novels in the 19th century by women writers, if you think about it now, as you'd ask the ordinary person, name an important 19th century novel by American woman. If people think very hard, they might say Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a great and totally underestimated novel in literary terms. I mean, I think Howe is really a great novelist. She's not thought about as a great novelist. She's thought about as someone who channeled divine inspiration to write about slavery, and that's how she's remembered. She's really an extraordinary artist. But generally, women's novels of the 19th century are manifold and forgotten, and they are now being reprinted by women's presses and university presses, but not really read by the general public. The short story began to develop as kind of an answer to this need of American women to express themselves. And as Annie has said, in the beginning, they were publishing in ladies' magazines like Godey's, and also in the form that was called the Literary Annual, which was a beautifully bound little book that came out once a year. And if you read diaries of 19th century women, it's almost always under the Christmas tree. You know, for young women, they get the annual and they read. And the annual was a kind of anthology. It had bits of poetry. It had bits of short stories. Those are about the 2 genres. I mean, that pretty much exhausts the genre. But they could read samples of what was going on, and they were also British fragments, so they were acquainted with that. And you could publish short stories in that form. And that began to change, as you mentioned, in 1857. The Atlantic Monthly is launched, and still going strong. Made a tremendous difference. It had literary credibility. If you were published in Godey's Lady's book, that would be like, trying to be a writer and being published in Good Housekeeping. Does Good Housekeeping still exist? I think it does. And, but the Atlantic Monthly published all the major writers. They published Henry James. They published Hawthorne. And it was really, when Louisa May Alcott got a story accepted by the Atlantic Monthly, that was a big moment and a big day in the Alcott household. She had really made it. That was her ambition. She was also writing for Sensation magazine. She was writing under a pseudonym, sensation stories, as Jo March does in Little Women. But the Atlantic Monthly kind of raised the bar for women writers who wanted to be serious artists and wanted to write in that genre. And as the century went on, as the 19th century went on, for various reasons, not only having to do with women, the short story became in many ways the dominant American genre of the 19th century. And by the end of the 19th century, people were saying it really somehow belonged to the American character. Just read it a little bit. This is the Atlantic Monthly in 1892. She said, saying, American writers have taken the short story as their province. There is no sign that the art is anywhere so rich, so various, so fresh as it is with us. And that's really true. You don't see short stories in England now. People are kind of looking for them, and there are anthologies beginning to appear. But you don't think of the 19th century British writers necessarily for their short stories. It was different for Americans, and you think about Hawthorne, you think about Melville, Poe, but particularly for women. There were many new magazines that opened after the Atlantic Monthly. There was an expanded market, and people thought two things. Not only that the short story was better suited to women than the novel, because it was short. In England, there was a kind of belief or prejudice until George Eliot came to show that it was wrong, that women did not have the physical strength to write a novel. Of course, British novels were long. They were often in 3 volumes. And it was like women were too frail. They couldn't produce a work. They needed smaller forms. Little as that's what happened. If Alcott had not called the book Little Women, I think a lot more men would have read it. So little was always damning. But there was a sense that the novel was a challenge, a physical challenge, an intellectual challenge. But women were attracted to the short story, as you see in some of the short stories you've been reading, because they didn't have time. They had to snatch the time to write from their household duties, for their responsibilities, and sometimes from husbands or fathers who didn't think women should be writing at all. It was very hard to sustain that kind of secrecy for the length of a whole novel. And so the short story became identified with women. And by the end of the 19th century, after 1857, when the Atlantic Monthly comes out, it begins to become more and more artful. And I think you can see this just in the stories that Annie selected in this series as you go on. It seems to me, when you get to Alcott, My Contraband, which is 1864, I think, if I'm right, I mean, the quality of art, the aesthetic dimensions of the writing are kind of a quantum leap beyond what you get in the early 19th century. They are taking themselves seriously as artists. They're drawing on all kinds of other sources. They're bringing into it not only the domestic environment and what you were saying about the true woman, and, piety, domesticity, purity, and so on, exploiting the very tiny little space that gives you as a writer. And they're moving to politics, they're moving to slavery, they're moving to the question of immigration, and they're moving inwards as well to psychology, as when you get to the end with Charlotte Perkins Gilman and her classic story, The Yellow Wallpaper, which is more relevant now. Every year it's more relevant to another generation of readers. So for all those reasons, the short story was, a great form for women. They didn't have to compete with Balzac. They didn't have to compete with Dickens. They were competing with each other, and they were competing with Hawthorne, and they were up to that. Okay, that's
wonderful. Thank you so much for putting it in context for us, Elaine. That was really just perfect. So now I guess we will open up to all of you to ask questions, or we want to hear your comments. Please, when you're ready, unmute yourself, and everyone else stay muted. Thank you.
Go ahead, Stacey.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elaine, for being here today, Dr. Showalter. This is so fantastic. I have, I guess my first question before we really get into the kind of heart of some of the stories is, I'd love to know how the process of putting together this book, like how did you choose the stories? Where did you find them? If you can kind of just take us through that journey of putting together the book, I think I would be so fascinated to know.
Well, it was a combination of teaching and my own private interests. I mean, I was trained as a Victorianist. I was trained as somebody who was going to be a specialist in British literature and fiction, and I had spent a couple of wonderful years in London, became totally obsessed with London, and still, except for this last year, have been spent part of the year in London every year since. So I thought of myself as really working with British writers, and then at some point, it occurred to me that I was neglecting my own heritage. I'm a Bostonian by birth. I mean, really one of the great centers of literary production, and especially for women, one of the great centers of publication, some of the great presses that were based in Boston, and some of them survive. And I thought, this is terrible that I know more about these minor British novelists than I do about the women who lived in my own city, in my own state, in my own country. So I started reading, and I had a colleague, Anne Douglas, name I don't know if any of you have heard of, was a professor at Columbia. And we met when we were quite young. I had got my first job at Rutgers, and she had got her first job at Princeton. And these, but I lived in Princeton, they were about 15 miles apart, and we immediately bonded. And she was an Americanist, and we made a bargain. This is all very, very girlish in some ways, but very serious and very important. We made a bargain. I would have all the English women writers, and she could have all the American women writers. Now, this may sound hilarious, but at that time we had no competition, really. I mean, we were going to divide the world of literature in this way, and it was no joke. Nobody was trying to write about these women. And at a certain point, I said, I have to violate the oath because I have to start reading about American women. And so that began a kind of search, and my teaching followed it. As I was reading for myself and starting to collect books, which at that point were out of print. It was only slowly that they began to be reprinted, often by university presses, then by women's presses, then by big presses, and so on, became available. I was also at a place, first at Rutgers and then at Princeton, that had great libraries. So I had the opportunity to look, but it was very personal. I mean, personal as a woman, personal as a feminist scholar, and very important. And it was wonderful to be making the discoveries. So thanks for asking that question.
Oh, thank you.
The opportunity to say these things. And Anne Douglas, I apologize. I'm sorry. I violated our oath.
Next question.
Yeah, I'm curious about, I was fascinated to hear about Jane Eyre. I had no idea she was so important to so many women in the 19th century. And I'm wondering why, maybe you have a theory, why not Wuthering Heights, or why not Jane Austen? Why was it Jane Eyre in particular?
Well, of course, people read Jane Austen, right? I think they did. I've never really researched it. And I think they must have read Emily Bronte, but it was Jane Eyre that really made the huge impact. I mean, it came over, it was published here, probably pirated, I haven't really checked, but it came over here on the heels of its huge reputation in England. And it was not only that the book itself was so sensational, and it still is, the great scene, the mad woman who comes down from the attic and sets fire to Rochester's bed, and burns the house down and so on. And the little governess in this incredible moment at the end, towards the end of the book, where she stands before her master, Rochester, and she says, I have to say little and poor and meek as I am, I have as much heart and soul and intellect as you. I mean, it's just so dynamic. How could you not fall in love with that heroine? And then following it, the realization of who Currer Bell, as they thought when it was first, who this was, and that it was Charlotte Bronte, this tiny little woman, daughter of a poor clergyman in the north of England, growing up in respectable poverty and overcoming so much to produce this book. I mean, it was so shocking. It was a great story. And it just traveled. American women identified with it massively, just as British women did. And probably in other countries, I haven't really followed how it was translated and what the appeal was. But it really struck a chord. And then in 1856, Elizabeth Gaskell, Bronte was then dead. She died so young, not even in childbirth, in pregnancy. She had a disease in pregnancy where she couldn't eat anything. Oh, they're so tragic. It's so awful. And she died very young. And Elizabeth Gaskell, who had known her, wrote a biography. And the biography, again, was just a bombshell. And people read about her life and what she had overcome, and how hopeful she had been, and the story of the three sisters and the drunken brother, and whatever, the whole history. And so she was just a culture heroine very, very soon. And there are many novels by American women that really are influenced by Jane Eyre, and they try to tell the story in an American way, from all different kinds of angles. Nobody could do it as well. I mean, there's no real, that's aiming pretty high, but it made a huge impact. And I think Emily Bronte, I don't know, it just took longer for that to have the same kind of impact. Not that it's any less thrilling a story or any less thrilling, a biography. The Brontes are so amazing and still are.
Do you think
still
that
such a magnet?
Do you think that Catherine from Wuthering Heights was maybe just too much for American women to see as a role model or to identify with?
I don't know. I mean, it's a great question. And I don't know that anybody has really written about the impact of the Brontes in American writing. I mean, you could say, of course, Catherine is just outrageous. And there are scenes, when I was starting to look at the novels, and we were all of us, I mean, there was a whole group of women academics who were in universities beginning to teach these books with feminist eyes and with feminist thoughts. And when you look at them, they have similar coded scenes. For example, Jane Eyre, very early in Jane Eyre, Jane has this sort of wicked stepmother. It's actually an aunt who locks her into what's called the Red Room. And in the Red Room, she's confined in this Red Room and she faints eventually. And the Red Room, to me, is such a symbol of menstruation. She is like 11 years old. And the imagery of this room is so much like it's about the confinement of womanhood. She is entering puberty. And the same thing in Wuthering Heights, there are scenes with Catherine Earnhardt in the very coded way that the Brontes had to write in the 1840s, that if you read them now, you get the sense that they are representing female puberty through a different kind of imagery. I mean, Catherine Earnhardt gets bitten by a dog at one point, and has to go stay with the Lintons. I mean, they're just this imagery. It's so potent. I don't know whether in the 19th century American women readers could have even understood that. I doubt it. They didn't have the vocabulary. They didn't have the insight, but they must have felt it.
Yeah.
You can feel that.
Yeah.
And American women were not writing that way. And what happens to the novel, I mean, the history of American women's writing is wonderfully dramatic and wonderfully set up for a literary historian, because the first, in my view, and nobody's argued with me about this yet, the first aesthetically perfect, let's say, novel by an American woman is Kate Chopin's The Awakening in 1899. What timing, on the very brink of the new century. And until then, there isn't any American woman novelist openly writing about female sexuality. They don't have the courage, they don't have the opportunity, they can't get anybody to publish it. I mean, it just doesn't happen. And the Brontes wrote in such intense symbolism that, you know, that it was marketable.
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to watch a woman in 1898 read The Awakening or The Storm or The Story of an Hour. I mean, it was so far removed from anything anyone had read before, I think.
Of course, and she paid for it. She paid for it. I mean, once The Awakening came out, here was this woman of genius, really, Kate Chopin, supporting 6 children with her writing. I mean, just so impressive. Now, she was in New Orleans and St. Louis. I mean, she was in a somewhat more progressive environment than the women writers who grew up in Boston, in my hometown, where they really had to find ways around it. But even so, that really pushed the limits of what was publishable and what was readable. And people were deeply shocked by it. And after that, she had trouble getting her stories accepted. I haven't followed. I think when I was first looking at that, I think there was some sort of a story that she could never get a short story accepted again. I don't want to say that as fact because I haven't checked. But she really, her literary career just stopped cold with that novel and with that fiction.
Mhm.
You had mentioned with Jane Eyre, unless I'm misinterpreting, that it wasn't a great model for American women because there was so much passion in it. And then I think you said, so they wrote sensation novels. So I guess I'm wondering, weren't the sensation novels, they may not have had artistic merit, but weren't they passionate and transgressive, or were they just boring and formulaic?
Gosh, I don't think I said that, Barbara. You're Barbara. Okay. I don't think I actually said that, but you're totally right. Yeah, and Louisa May Alcott, you know, under her pseudonym A.M. Barnard, wrote sensation novels, and they are some of the stories most directly affected by Jane Eyre. Really, really coming from the same impulse. And she's looking for a literary genre to use, and she goes to sensation fiction, published in what people would have regarded in those days as trashy magazines, which of course sold thousands of copies, and that was a secret thing. She had to conceal it, and you know, nothing that a nice girl like Louisa May Alcott should be caught doing, and did. And they are wonderful. Those sensation stories, you really have to read.
Were they read by women? Were they read by women? Did women find that trash, or who?
I don't think anybody knows. I mean, they were published under a pseudonym. They were published in magazines that they weren't in the Atlantic Monthly. You know, if they were in the Atlantic Monthly, you might have a way of following up. Even if they were in Godey's or Munsey's or any of the, you know, the big circulation magazines, you might have a way of tracing the readership. No idea what the readership was, or what or how they would have felt. But then it wasn't until, I don't know, something like the 1930s, maybe 1940s, where 2 women scholars discovered that Louisa May Alcott had written under a pseudonym. And they set themselves out to track down the stories. And that was the first time that anybody realized they existed. And they were read. These women published them and wrote about them, and they were really responsible for it. And so it was an incredible, again, moment of recognition that here was this woman writer famous for Little Women, which she herself always regretted writing. You know, she said, why did I do this? I never even liked girls, she said, except my sisters. How did I get hooked into this? And people think of me as a name that she used to use sometimes as a pseudonym, Aunt Jo. She was, you know, lovely old, nice old Aunt Jo. And here she was capable of these extraordinary fantasies and even unpublished work. I mean, Harvard has incredible archive in the Houghton Library, has incredible Alcott archive. And when I was starting doing this, and I went there, and there are unpublished novels by Alcott that they're probably now been published in part, but are much more shocking even than the sensation stories. She had all these wonderful fantasies about women who were approached basically by the devil under some disguise. And the devil would offer them a deal that, you know, if they would do what he wanted, he would make them great writers or take them on a great adventure and so on. Yeah, and she privately made that deal. They're fabulous stories, and they're sometimes very funny. There's one, I can't remember the title now, and I didn't prepare for you to tell you this, but one of the great stories, it's about a governess who goes to the place where she's going to be a governess, and she meets her master. This is very Jane Eyre, okay? The second half of Jane Eyre. She goes and she meets the master and everything, and she comes in, and everybody says, oh, she's wonderful, she's just perfect, she's so sweet, and she's so demure, and she's so pious, and she's, you know, she pleases everybody, and she's so shy and everything like this, and so young. And then at the end of this part, she goes up to the room that she's assigned in the house, and she wipes off all of her makeup. She's been made up to look young, and she gets total full makeup. She takes off her hair extensions. It's hilarious. And then at the end, she takes out her teeth, not a whole set, but individual ones. She's got the teeth. And it says, and then she looks at herself in the mirror, and there she was, revealed as a jaded, haggard old woman of 30. So there you go. And that's the secret self. And she is really plotting to marry the master of the house and, you know, get the money away from the children and so on. Wonderful story. So she gets at the subterranean, you know, revenge plots of Jane Eyre, I guess, and turns them into this context.
Thank you.
I know what it's called. Remember what that story is called? Behind a Mask. That's right, Behind a Mask. One of the great sensation stories. And they have now been collected. And they're not as good as My Contraband. I think My Contraband is a wonderful story. The sensation stories are, in literary terms, not as good. I mean, that scene where she takes out the teeth and everything is pretty far-fetched, but they're a lot of fun.
Do you think that the visits of Anthony Trollope's mother and sister-in-law, who were both novelists of quite considerable success in England, had any impact on the ability of women to begin to feel confident enough to write and publish?
I honestly don't know. I think it was a little soon. I think they came over a little early for the kind of big wave of women writers, but I don't think that they met women writers. I think they were traveling. They didn't go to Boston. They weren't in the kind of urban centers where women writers tended to be gathering. I don't think so. It's an interesting question because she was certainly an amazing personality, Frances Trollope. She had a big influence. Edmond White, some of you may recognize the name of Edmond White, who was actually incredible novelist, maybe a gay novelist, but he wrote a book about Frances Trollope. He was so impressed about her. He's a contemporary, you know. But I haven't seen any impact in the women writers of the 19th century. They were getting, it was not face to face, you know, or close by that they were getting their influences until much, much later. And they didn't really know each other. And that's well into the 20th century. And as I was doing this literary history, you read about male writers. And when I was in college, this was one of the things that always used to astonish me, but it always seemed in class like a very dumb question I couldn't ask. How was it when you studied all these great male writers, they all knew each other? You know, I mean, I used to think about the romantic writers, Wordsworth and Shelley and Coleridge, they all knew each other. How did they know each other? You know, how did this start? And then I said, did they become great writers after they were famous? Or did they partly become famous because they knew each other and they had a circle, you know? And I thought, how is this for women? Women did not get to meet each other until about 1940. I'm not exaggerating. Where would they have met? You know, they didn't meet at university. They didn't meet in politics. They met in the suffrage movement. That was important for a number of women. They did meet in the suffrage movement, and some of them met through abolition. But generally, they didn't meet as writers. In the 1940s, when men were mostly at the war, there was a great writers' center, Yaddo, in upstate New York, a famous one that still continues. And it's a retreat where writers, have all their expenses paid, and they go and they have their room and their board, and they can have a month or two and just write. And because a lot of the men were drafted, for the first time women came. And all these women writers were there at the same time. And it's practically the first time they were always together. They were actually together. Fascinating. And now some of you may know about the Radcliffe Center, the Women's Center at Radcliffe. It's the Schlesinger Center, which was started, I think, in the late 1960s and became another place where women writers came together to work. And of course, now there are lots of places where women can meet as writers, but it wasn't possible for a long time unless they had a sister, which many of them did, or a mother. They got it through the family, but not through a circle.
I have a question for everybody. In my contraband, do people think that the nurse was falling in love with Robert?
That the nurse was falling in love with Robert? What do you think? Do you think, is that?
I didn't think so, but I read somewhere that that's what was happening, but I kind of didn't get that feeling that they were, but I don't know how everybody else felt about it.
Well, I mean, there are so many subtexts in that story, aren't there? One way and another. I mean, so much is going on in that story. And of course, Alcott was a nurse in the Civil War in Georgetown. A hospital in Georgetown doesn't exist anymore. It was a very short time that she was there because she got terrible fever. I can't remember which kind of fever it was. And she suffered for it all through
Typhoid.
Typhoid.
Yeah, and her father had to come and take her home. But when he took her home, she was already hallucinating. I mean, she had terrible nightmares, and she wrote about it. And clearly, this is a product of that period. And she had wanted to go to the island off South Carolina where freed slaves went and formed a group during the Civil War. And there was a whole group, and a lot of the abolitionists then were going down to teach them. And Alcott aspired to that, but couldn't go because of her health. So there's a lot of all kinds of different levels of fantasy in that story that come across. And the narrator certainly is incredibly attracted to that man. And she talks about him in ways that would be quite scandalous generally for a woman in the 19th century, Nurse Stane. So it's quite powerful.
Did her, when she wrote that was a very much more dense and much more, there's a lot more information and much more feeling, I think, in hers and the previous ones that were read. And was she an influence afterwards with some of these women that they made their short stories more dense, more characterizations in the more emotional things in their short stories after her? Did she influence anybody? And also, did they ever have any in other countries? Did other women write short stories in like Italy or Spain or Germany, or was it just in the United States in England that wrote short stories?
Well, there were some. I mean, obviously, it had to be some. I don't want to rule it out, but nowhere near as many. And the British are talking, I don't know the situation in France or Russia or whatever, but I know the British do talk about it. And there's an interest now in they recuperate some kind of British tradition of the short story in the 19th century, even in the 20th story. British writers tended to go straight to the novel. And there are some, but not like the ones here. I mean, George Eliot wrote short stories, so it was not unheard of. But generally, and there's some really amazing British short story writers at the end of the 19th century. But basically, it's seen as an American mode. And Alcott might have been one, but obviously there was Hawthorne, there was Melville, there were writers later in the period, and they were available and accessible. And I think generally women aspired to them, and it seemed within reach. Unlike a novel was really complicated. You had to get a publisher. You had to go to one of the important publishers. You had to write, your letter. You had to see what was going to happen. Probably certain kind of political issues about that. Whereas the short stories, seemed closer, I think, or within reach, let's say, within reach.
But Mary, you had another half of your question, right? Didn't you, Mara?
Oh, yeah, no, I just wanted to know if she had influenced other people, Louisa May Alcott, in this type of writing that she did. I thought she had much more development of character and much more of a story, and it was much longer than most of the other stories that were read.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if her writing influenced after her, that kind of more intense writing in the short story than some of the other women that were read.
I think I'm just looking at this now. When I wrote about it, my contraband in my book of literary history, she is definitely. I mean, I think one of the ways I would think about what you've suggested is that the title "My Contraband" is also kind of personal. I mean, my contraband. She identifies so much with him, and she, in a sense, is a contraband figure too. She's betwixt and between. Mm-hmm. Not only being a woman writing about this and a woman nursing, which in the Civil War was a pretty edgy thing. Remember, Whitman was a Civil War nurse, and that was the first time with Clara Barton that women were recruited to work as nurses in the military hospital, seeing naked men and so on and so forth. But she's a contraband figure because she is partly struggling against her desire for the Black contraband, or the mixed race contraband. And he himself is represented as a divided soul. One half of his face is incredibly handsome. The other half is incredibly scarred and damaged. I mean, the symbolism is not subtle exactly, but it is definitely very, very powerful. And Alcott's writing about race, when I was reviewing the story to talk about it today, I was sort of wondering, a little hesitant, especially now, in the incredibly charged period that we're all going through, was I going to feel that Alcott had really failed on the question of race and the way she wrote about race? And I know she didn't. I don't know what you thought about it. I thought it was tremendously positive and progressive and open in the way she talked about it. She was, of course, an abolitionist in an abolitionist family and a kind of abolitionist culture, but even so, she herself had very little contact certainly with slaves or ex-slaves. There were some emancipated, free Black citizens in Boston, but I don't think Alcott came into contact with them very much. So this is all kind of her imagination, and I think it's quite revealing. Also, she makes him a little bit Spanish, which was one of her metaphors for passion, the Spaniard. And when she was having her hallucinatory dreams, when she had typhoid fever, one of the dreams that she remembered and talked about was a dream that she was being threatened by a Spaniard, all dressed in black. I don't know what that was with the Inquisition. I mean, where did that image come from? She probably never met a Spaniard. Well, she did go to Europe, so I take it back. Maybe she did. But it was very much a figure that came out of her imagination and out of fantasy. But it was, hot countries, Mediterranean, very different from Boston. Anyway.
Dr. Showalter, thank you so much for being here this evening. I'm wondering if there were any kind of movements that women were trying to follow before Jane Eyre. I mean, Jane Eyre kind of popped in during the middle of transcendentalism, and were they kind of following that movement and wanting to get in there, or was it, Hawthorne was the one who, called women scribbling women. So, yeah, I mean, how much was it invited or uninvited?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And like so much about women's literary history, I mean, these things are really open questions. I mean, when I wrote this book, A Jury of Her Peers, this is the first literary history of women. It came out with 2009. It's incredible. And it's still the only one. People just didn't want to tackle it. I mean, it's always a big job to take on. And most literary histories, especially national ones, are written by committees. And the official literary histories of the United States were written by huge committees, 50 people. And the official one, the biggest one that was undertaken, had 50 editors, 49 of them men. And the 50th was the wife of one of the men, probably typing. So to try to do a literary history of American women writers and to be one person was an incredible task. And believe me, there is so much left to do. And the questions you're asking reminding me of that. But I don't think Hawthorne was a big influence. He was a presence, you know, he was alive. A lot of them knew him, especially the ones around Boston. He did not like women writers. He was not hospitable to them, as some of them were, and Thoreau was friendlier. Blocking in the name, but I'll come back. There were some other 19th century. Longfellow was extremely friendly to women writers, but Hawthorne was not. He was aloof. But the early novels by American women writers were really dealing with American history, Puritan history, and Native Americans. They're very interesting. I mean, they're really quite terrific, I think, some of them. And that's what they start out, they're quite realistic. And they start with that. And they are also, like all very broad-minded. Some of the early ones, the heroine falls in love, you know, the John Wayne plot, you know, is abducted by a Native American tribe and falls in love with her abductor. Stockholm syndrome, maybe we would say, but you know, in early 19th century terms, very enlightened in other ways and sexually very enlightened. So the writing in the second half of the 19th century is much freer than that early writing. And the novels too, which I don't want to be simple-minded about them and say they're not important. They are important. Some of them are really interesting, but they are specialist topics. I don't see any of them really having a revival. Some of them were very prolific and they take different paths, and some of them are more experimental than others, but there's no dominant mood that comes through. Whereas the short story, I think, evolves in art so clearly and dramatically. And even with this limited selection of short stories, you can see it as you move through and you go from two authors to Alcott, and then you go to Chopin and Sedgwick,
Gilman.
Yeah, to Gilman. You just see these incredible aesthetic leaps between, and they are reading, by the end, they are also reading Maupassant, they are reading continental sources, they are much more sophisticated in all kinds of ways. And so their influence really goes beyond New England and the transcendentalists, the very famous ones. I think for Alcott, the main British influence, apart from the Brontes, is Dickens. And if you've read Little Women, you know this, because so much of it is about the Pickwick Club, and they pretend to be characters out of Dickens. And it's just written there right out. You know, they admired Dickens so hugely, and not a bad choice. You know, if you're going to have a novelist to emulate, you could do a lot worse than Dickens.
Elaine, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
I'm wondering if you might be willing to comment a little bit on a more recent subject you've worked on, Julia Ward Howe, and how she figures into some of the landscape you're describing. In some ways, kind of on either side of the short story, you have poetry.
Yeah.
And here's Julia Ward Howe writing something like Passion Flowers and publishing it early, and where she's maybe not breaking form in the same way that Dickinson is, she's certainly breaking subject matter.
Oh, totally.
And then also a novel like The Hermaphrodite, which she doesn't publish.
I know.
Unlike Chopin, who somewhat later, of course, publishes. But here are these, in both poetic and novelistic forms, she's dealing with issues of passion and sexual identity really quite early on, quite a bit before Chopin. So I'm wondering, and I don't think she touches the form of the short story quite as much, but I'm just wondering how you sort of place her among this tableau of other scribbling women.
Well, she's a bit of an outlier, but you know, it's not a huge group, and she's a very special case. And for people who don't know, Julia Ward Howe always wanted to be a poet. she had very special advantages / disadvantages. Her father was very, very rich. He was a religious conservative, very much an evangelical Christian. He did not think the daughters should go out practically ever. He had them educated at home. There were 3 daughters and 3 sons. All the sons went to Columbia, as it was, and they all went to Europe, and they were all doing whatever they would. And she was exactly the same age as Walt Whitman, Julia Ward Howe. So here's Walt Whitman, also growing up in New York, going to the bars, going to the theaters, going to the streets, going to street fights, everywhere. And she can go nowhere. She couldn't even go to school. Everything comes in, and he censored her reading. So as a poet, she managed to read Byron, but there wasn't a lot of poetry that she got to read. So her poetic models were pretty limited. And when she was married, against her husband's wishes, and partly because she was unhappy in the marriage, she wrote a book of poems, which she called unwisely Passion Flowers, giving it away. But of course, that was the period. It was published at the same time as Leaves of Grass. I mean, flowery, botanical titles. So it came out, and she got it accepted by a very eminent publisher in Boston who had just turned down a book by her husband. I mean, talk about the sexual politics in this. She did not tell her husband she was writing it. She had 3 sisters she was very attached to. And I said, it helped if you had sisters, you did have some kind of circle. And she said to the sisters, I haven't told him. Do you think this is wise? If I told him, he would try to stop it, but I'm going to tell him at Christmas when the book arrives. So then comes Christmas Eve. Happy Christmas, Merry Christmas, darling. Here's my book of poems you don't know about, and they're all about you and what a horrible marriage we have. So you can imagine. And in addition, Longfellow had helped her do it. He had been kind of introduced her to the publisher. So total betrayal. You have to feel sympathy for the husband to some degree. But he reacted so extremely, and he had the power to do it. They, at that point, had 4 children. He said, this has got to stop. And the book was very successful. It went through 2 editions. It was going to be in a 3rd edition. It was incredibly well reviewed. Of course, it was anonymous, but in Boston, people knew. They figured it out pretty fast. Just rave reviews from everybody, including Hawthorne. He said, that's it, no 4th edition. This has got to stop. And they had not been sleeping together for a while. She had a lot of children, and that was her form of birth control in a way. After one pregnancy, she'd be nursing the kid as long as she could. And he said, that's over. You have to come back and share my bed. And within 3 months, and he said, if you don't do it, I'm going to divorce you and take the children. And she gave in. And we have all the letters about this because she was writing to her sisters. I mean, this is kind of a wonderful thing about doing this. She was writing all about it to her sisters. And she wrote some poems again, but they're very boring. It was like poem on the 4th of July, that kind of thing. Not the same kind of thing that there was in Passion Flowers. Passion Flowers is not a great debut as such, but it's the beginning. And you can imagine, this is the first book of poems. If she had had any encouragement or support, people did like it. She could have gone on if she was able to be around other poets and talk to them about it and read. But the development is just cut off. It's, the little flower shoots up and somebody stamps on it. So that was what happened. And then secretly, she was writing a novel. This is in the 1840s. It's almost incredible. In the context of the marriage, about a hermaphrodite. She had read Balzac, and she had lived in Europe for a couple of years. Her husband took her to Europe on their honeymoon for over a year because he wanted to look at hospitals and medical schools. It was a sort of research thing for him. But she went to the museums and she saw statues of the hermaphrodite in Rome. And she wrote about a child who was born with the genitals of both sexes, but raised as a boy. And what it would be like to be that person. Incredibly modern, I mean, terrifyingly modern in many ways. And at some points, cross dresses and sometimes has friends who fall in love with him at college, you know, all this kind of thing. It's not a great, it's really, as a novel, first of all, it's in fragments, bits and pieces in the manuscript. She never showed it to anybody. She didn't even tell her sister she was writing it, but she kept it. And it's all in the archive at Harvard, every bit of it. It's just so astonishing. And it was discovered, I mean, I think in the late 1960s, a graduate student was there and found it. And then other scholars went to look at it and edited it, did the work of trying to put it together in some sequence and called it the Hermaphrodite. So these are just, you know, these are embryos really of what might have been, and they stopped growing. They're hot. They, you know, can't even tell anybody about it. But I think what I think about it is that it's proof that the potential was there. You know, I mean, it's one way of arguing that it wasn't that women weren't capable of this, that American women weren't capable of it. It's just that they had no outlets. I mean, they had no way of expressing this. And as I said, Dickinson solved some of it by becoming a total recluse, a virgin, you know, never publishing anything so that nobody would review it and say, this is outrageous. And interestingly, and kind of sadly for me, Julia Ward Howe, who by that time had gone on to other things and was a major figure in the women's suffrage movement and so on, I never read Emily Dickinson. She was alive when Dickinson was published, never read it. She did read Whitman, said she thought he was overrated, but I have never been able to find any indication that she read Dickinson. So the evolution of women's poetry in the 19th century is just, you know, stunted in so many ways, sadly.
Great, thank you.
So if anyone would like to read more about Julia Ward Howe, I am here to recommend Dr. Showalter's fabulous biography, The Civil Wars of Julia Ward Howe. And in my mind, this represents this extraordinary woman's life. It represents the battle that I think so many women of the 19th century went through just to be able to express their creativity, their sense of self, their equality to men. And Julia, was one who really ultimately succeeded. And on that note, I'm afraid our time is up. I wish we could continue longer, but it is 7:04. So Dr. Showalter, thank you so much for joining us, for really enlivening this conversation and bringing your wonderful insight to the lives of these women who I am so glad that we have discovered.
Yeah,
And,
well, I want to thank you all for your terrific questions, and also just to point out that almost all the stories really are about women who want to write and have to deal with the family, have to deal sometimes, by the end, are dealing specifically with the husband. And that is really, they don't have they're not talking about the magazines rejecting them or the problem with the literary market. It's in the home. And that's where it starts, but they're so challenging. And by the end, with the yellow wallpaper, have turned that marital conflict, which she lived, Gilman totally lived, have turned it into this extraordinary classic Gothic tale.
please do not miss that story on Sunday at 4 p.m. That will be the last in our series. It is really I mean, having read it aloud, I was completely exhausted by the end of that. It is so powerful. So I encourage all of you to join us on Sunday at 4 p.m. And thank you again, Dr. Showalter. And now I will turn it over to Emily Hill-Wright.
All right, thank you both so much. This was just a really wonderful evening. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. Before we say goodnight, as many of you know, for the last 9 years, the Merchants House has been fighting proposed development next door, a development that is unfortunately guaranteed to cause irreversible structural damage and possibly collapse to our landmark building. Sadly, there is still a very long and very expensive fight ahead of us. You can sign our petition and submit a letter to the Landmarks Preservation Commission on our website at merchantshouse.org. And please tell your friends. And if you are able, please do consider making a donation or becoming a member. You can join online at merchantshouse.org/support. We cannot do this without you, and your donation really may never mean more than it does today. As an added incentive, members do receive free admission to all of our regular virtual programming. On April 22nd, join us for the premiere of our new monthly series, In the Spirit of Science, where paranormal investigator Dan Sturgis and neuroscientist Dr. Lee search for spirits in the Merchant's House using science and the scientific method. Each month, they will explore a different aspect of the paranormal, so we hope that you'll join us. And then at the end of the month, too, please don't miss the next in our Behind the Ropes series, all about the architecture of our 1832 landmark building. So we hope to see you there. Next month, the Merchant's House, which opened to the public on May 11th, 1936, is celebrating its 85th anniversary. So please keep an eye on our website, merchantshouse.org, for some exciting new programs as we celebrate our 85th year as a museum. So thank you again so much for joining us. Thank you especially to Dr. Showalter for being here tonight, and have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.